Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see a full room. I'm absolutely delighted to be sharing the platform with these three chaps because when I first came across this discussion some time ago, it really struck me that I was looking at what seemed to me to be one of the most significant conversations being held anywhere. If you look out there in mainstream society, you find fragments of conversations, fragments of issues about this sort of stuff. It's extremely rare to find an attempt to systematically track it through, work it through scenarios, and be as careful and as systematic as Mike and Bill have been. Moreover, I've absolutely enjoyed the dynamic between them because I know they don't agree with everything, and the three of us actually don't agree with everything, and that doesn't matter because it's, as Bill said, something to work through, and the dynamic has been brilliant. I just want to add that because Marien and I were traveling from Australia, we weren't able to bring PowerPoints, handouts with us. So what I've done is to put them on my weblog, richardslaughter.com.au. On the front page, there's a section called Toronto Resources, and if you click on that page, you'll find a section called the Mega Crisis session. And there are a couple of short papers and a bibliography. I started to collect a bibliography on this subject because this is something I'm going to stick with and continue with as time goes by. Very, very briefly, my view is not a gloom and doom view, despite what these folks would have you believe. I've just taken on the mantle of the gloom and doom person today. But I do believe, there's absolutely no doubt in my own mind, that we are facing what I call a true global emergency. And I believe that the only way that makes sense, at least to me, is to seek clarity. Clarity is such an important aspect of this, on what we're facing, and then work in every way we can to mobilize on a society-wide basis to deal with it. Some people have suggested the onset of war as an analogy, but obviously that isn't the case because we don't all agree about a common external threat. If we can at least get some mobilized activity happening, we can maybe move through this sequence of understanding, leading to new motivation, developing capacity, and action. But as the three of us demonstrate, there is really no single view or perspective on the global mega crisis or global emergency. Moreover, not only do we not agree, but large numbers of people are unaware of it, and some are in denial. One interesting look at that is the book called Merchants of Doubt, which some of you may have seen, by Oreskes and Conway, which looks at the evolution of denialism, if you like, from the early days, from Rachel Carson on, provides some very interesting perspective on where we are. So from my point of view, I think humanity is in an extremely tight situation, and one possible result of that is some sort of collapse. What we mean by that, though, really has a lot of possible interpretations. One of my starting points is to go to earth science, and there was some research done by John Rockstrom and his team a while ago, published in Nature. And it was about the way that in their research they'd really picked up the way that certain global limits, in their view, looking at the data from a whole range of sources, had already been exceeded. One of those is climate change, another one was the rate of species extinctions, and the third was the nitrogen cycle, because of humans manufacturing nitrogen, only a certain amount of it being recycled naturally. In the view of this research, limits likely to be exceeded in the near future included ozone depletion, freshwater availability, ocean acidification, which is a huge issue in its own right, and land use changes. What they didn't have enough data to decide was issues around atmosphere, aerosol loading, and chemical pollution. Now, in terms of responding, I came across this site on the internet which showed examples of tsunami markers in Japan. Japan has a lot of experience, historical experience of tsunamis. And yet what's interesting is that that experience gets forgotten and set aside. So that it seems that you have to keep repeatedly going through these cycles. So it was interesting to look at the Limits to Growth 30-year update back in 2004 and to see the Meadows team discussing ways of responding to crises. And they picked out 3 possibilities. One was deny, disguise, or confuse the signals, which is, I reckon, pretty universal. Secondly, respond by alleviating pressures through technological fixes, which is quite common. And thirdly, the most challenging one, but perhaps the most useful, is working on the underlying causes and changing the structure of the system. That's something that Donella Meadows had a vast amount of useful stuff to say about. Her piece on where to intervene in systems, for example, is an absolute classic. So the search for solutions seems to me to be well-intentioned in many cases, but mostly partial and to some extent ineffectual. Now, I know this is not everybody's cup of tea, but I found this integral model of the 4 quadrants pretty handy in this respect, because what it does is to direct our attention to different windows on reality, if you like. And those of you that are familiar with this understand it straight away. Those of you who are not familiar, I'll briefly explain that the lower right, rather it's a distinction between interior and exterior and individual and collective. So if the lower right is the exterior collective, that's basically the whole physical world. The lower left is the interior of the collective, that's to say the interior of cultures. That's language, meaning, tradition, institutions, organizations. The upper right is the you and I as known to science, everything that's external, measurable, the behavioral quadrant, if you like, the quadrant that athletes are now totally concerned with over there in London. But the upper left is the unique world of each individual. And it's these interior quadrants, the upper left and the lower left, that seem to have been overlooked in so many areas. I've used this as a tool to look at some of the work that's been done. This is quite an old piece of work. In a couple of the papers that I mentioned that are available on the website, I've dealt with some more recent ones. In this older book, what I did was to take out all the subheadings and to try and see where they basically fitted. That's not to say that any particular phenomenon occupies just one area. Often they occupy more than one, they relate to more than one. But in terms of where they're grounded, where they fit best. And you can see we've got some big gaps when it comes to human agency, human understanding and what people actually do. Two recent books that I've put out are Biggest Wake-Up Call in History and most recently Integral Futures and the Global Emergency. I want to get away from collapse. I understand how useful that is. Jared Diamond's work, Tainter, so many other people have written on collapse, and that's a useful literature. It's part of the bibliography. But I really want to make a change away from just thinking about collapse to transition from one state to another. In The Biggest Wake-Up Call, I spent half the book looking at what is the problem, and the second half of the book working off of topics like these, which are all strategies that people have developed to address the global emergency. I'll just mention a couple. One that I have a great deal of time for is Tony Fry's work on design futuring, where he's actually trying to reform the design professions in order to get them to take responsibility for this very fragile and threatened world. But another one that's come up a couple of times during this conference are transition towns. And notice it's towns, not cities in general, because I think it's easier to do in smaller locations. This is something that began in Totnes in Devon in the UK a few years ago. And basically people were seeing the writing on the wall with regard to climate change, with regard to peak oil, other issues, and they have autonomously decided to try and start working on these in a locality, community fashion. So there's a Transition Towns handbook, there's a network, there are the websites. It's one of the responses. In the second book, covers 3 areas about integral thinking and dealing with these big issues in a sort of structured way, beginning with early perspectives, going on to case studies, and then focusing on human and social development. Now, what I found by going through this kind of material was that another narrative was emerging that took us somewhat away from the dire warnings of imminent collapse. There's something about collapse that's demotivating and really not very encouraging. I'm sure you can imagine what it is. But there's an awful lot to explore and understand and deal with in terms of understanding descent, D-E-S-C. And it's a conscious, it indicates a kind of conscious moving away from the peak of industrial civilization. Peak, not meaning the peak of civilization in terms of its achievements, which are huge, but in terms of the throughput of energy, the kind of systems that we rely on, the destructive impacts that they're all largely having on the wider world. Here, there are many possibilities of intervention, and the person I found most useful, I don't know if any of you have heard of John Michael Greer, his two books, The Long Descent and The Ecotechnic Future, seem to me to have an awful lot of detailed understanding of what those descent scenarios could well be like. So I'd certainly recommend those. But from my point of view, the real issues are not really so much about the external world, they're about how we respond, how we see, perceive, understand and respond to these things. So in Biggest Wake-Up Call, I look at the difference between pre-conventional, conventional and post-conventional thinking. I'm not going to go through it in any detail because Mike's writing me a note and I need to wrap up. But the point is that as you go through those stages, it's an increased area of capability. So I tried to look at ways of finding a guiding kind of image or concept in the abstract where we could run on the horizontal axis low-tech to high-tech, and on the vertical axis values and worldviews. I won't go through this in detail, but I will make the point that the intersection of advanced values and greatly evolved worldviews with high-tech seems to me to identify a sweet spot where we can actually begin to see some really powerful possibilities for resolving these things and moving on past them. One way to do that is to render them through those quadrants, and that's just a tool, but the value of that tool is the way it helps us to redistribute our efforts so that we're not merely thinking of technology, we're also thinking about those interior, cultural, and individual factors. And then finally, in conclusion, my takeaway message, at least the one that works for me, is that this is challenging, but it is not necessarily depressing. It's not depressing because we have many degrees of freedom, many options, many ways of handling this. The question is, do we make the progress that we need to? I basically agree with what Tad Homer Dixon said in one of his recent pieces, that the problem resides as much in our heads as it does in the external world. So for me, this is the essence, not of gloom and doom, but certainly what I think of as the civilizational challenge that we face. Thank you.